Hello everybody and welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. As promised, this week I'll be talking all about something that I've been meaning to cover on this channel for a while, but just haven't yet for some reason, and that is dungeons. More specifically, how I make them and what my process is. This video will be more of a broad overview, and I'd like to do videos in the future on some of the more intricate details and zoom in a little bit, but for today, we're going to keep it kind of broad. This video is going to be a little bit longer than my usual videos, and it'll be more of a discussion than a bunch of listed points about DMing. I'm going to talk a little bit first about structure, and then move on to the fun details of how I actually fill a dungeon and flavor the encounters in it, and finally I'll talk very generally about my overall process and end off with an example. I really hope that you enjoy it. If you do, feel free to leave a like. That lets me know what I'm doing well and where I can stand to improve. And if you've been at this channel for a while, you know just how much I love improving this channel for all of you, so don't be afraid to let me know. Speaking of which, you can also comment if you have any specific feedback or even if you disagree with me. Also, if you have any video suggestions, let me know, or if you just want to say hi, I almost always respond. And if you really like the kinds of videos that I make, feel free to subscribe and get notified whenever I release a new one. And with that out of the way, let's talk about dungeons. So let's get started and let's learn something. First, let me go ahead and define what I mean when I say dungeon. That way the rest of my suggestions in this video have context and make a little bit more sense. This isn't an official definition or anything like that. Again, this is just to provide context for what I'm going to say. So what is a dungeon? For me, a dungeon is any enclosed space, like a cave, a kobold base, an old ruined house, or maybe even an actual dungeon, just for a few examples, that your players find themselves in, either because they were sent there or decided to explore it, or something else, in which several distinct encounters are placed before them. These encounters can be linear or spread out, in which your players can do them in whatever order they like. I'll talk more about that later, and there's usually some kind of goal, like to find an ancient artifact, and some final challenge, like a boss. But I'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. But first up, before we even talk about what's in the dungeon, what it looks like, or even what it actually is, like whether it's a cave or a goblin den or what have you, we're going to talk a little bit about structure. So remember when I said earlier that you can make the encounters in your dungeon more or less linear depending on what you're going for? Well, that's what I'll be talking about here. And I'll be completely honest and upfront right out the gate, I have a strong preference for more linear dungeons. And by a linear dungeon, I mean a dungeon where the encounters are predetermined to happen in a very specific order. So you may have a social encounter at a cave entrance with whatever hermit figure who may live here. Maybe they warn the players about dangers deep in the cave. You may then have a stealth encounter where you introduce a giant sleeping monster and the players have to get past it. Then maybe a trap, some combat, after that a puzzle, and then finally a boss fight. But of course, this is not the only structure you might use when creating a dungeon. You can use pretty much whatever encounters you want and put them in pretty much whatever order you want. I think that about 6 or 7 different encounters is a pretty good starting point, but again, that depends on what kind of dungeon you're trying to run and what kind of encounters you want to put within it. In fact, if you want, as a quick challenge, feel free to think of about 6 or 7 different types of encounters and string them together in some kind of order. You don't have to have a dungeon or a concept unless you want to, feel free to. Just think of some encounters and put them together. Feel free to let me know what you come up with in the comments, and later on in this episode, we'll be talking about different ways to flavor your encounters and different ways to make them make sense and give them a reason to work together. Feel free to use these encounters and make a full dungeon while you're listening to this episode. Often, if I don't have any real ideas or any kind of basic concept to work off of, I might just begin with a very basic structure just like this and then build off from there. But that really depends on where I begin, and it depends on what kinds of ideas I have. Often I find my process is very non-linear when creating a dungeon, but I'll talk more about that later on. And of course, I didn't just start with structure because I think it's always a good place to start. I do not believe there is just one good place to always start with. I started with structure because I think it is a good place to build off of when talking about how to build a dungeon. I think that it provides a good framework for which later on we can talk about how to fill up the dungeon and what to actually put in it. First though, these specific encounters you might make, for example a puzzle or a trap or some kind of combat, might even be any more linear dungeon separated by rooms. And before you say anything, I get it. This sounds pretty railroady and maybe even a little boring. And this is one of the major criticisms that you'll often hear about more linear dungeons. But this kind of format is tried and true, and honestly I see nothing wrong with it. However, you might want to do a few things to remedy some of that blandness that might come with it, and here's how I do it. One of the very first things that I do, and again this is so written in my process that I do it kind of automatically at this point, is I find some other kind of structures to hold each encounter in other than just rooms. Now going back to what I said earlier, my structure and my process is very non-linear, so I may start out with an actual concept, and if I do, I won't have to spend too much time right here because what these rooms are is already pretty obvious right out the gate. Like if I'm making an actual dungeon, for example, I know a lot of the rooms are going to be cells connected by hallways or something. But even if you do already already know basically what the rooms are going to be, it still helps to go back over and see if there are any rooms for improvement so that you can still flavor them in some kind of way so it's a little bit less bland. Let's look at how I might do this with the previous example that I just gave, the cave example. We could say that the social encounter could occur at the cave mouth. After walking down a long tunnel, the cave might open up into a narrow pass next to a precipitous drop over which a giant monster hangs asleep. And this is where the stealth encounter occurs. There may be a door at the very top of this precipitous pass with a trap on it, on the other side of which is a long corridor abandoned in disrepair. Maybe a bunch of monsters have taken up refuge inside, and after defeating them, there's a puzzle the players must solve that lets them get into the next chamber or the bosses. Maybe this next chamber isn't even a chamber. Maybe it's actually outside, and the mountain is impossible to climb from the outside. Maybe the monster they fight as the boss at the end of this dungeon lived on the top of this mountain that they unknowingly climbed when they traveled through that precipitous path they went across earlier. Mountaintop combats are always fun. But again, like I keep saying, that's just one way of doing it. As a quick challenge, feel free to think of your own way that you might go about flavoring, big air quotes here, the rooms that I outlined in that first example, or even make up your own. Feel free to leave your answers in the comments. I can't wait to see what you think. But I never discussed why I prefer these more linear dungeons. Well, I'll answer that with a question. Have you ever started to run a pre-made dungeon, took one look at the map and saw countless interwoven corridors and thought, wow, this is going to be confusing? Well, I have, and I've seen it happen before. Now, don't get me wrong. If you want to put a big map on your table and cover up different parts as your players progress through it, leaving big sections aside for combat, then go for it. I just find all that stuff to be a bit distracting from the actual encounters that I'm trying to run during that dungeon. In addition to a more linear dungeon being more straightforward, it also lends itself very nicely to storytelling, and it is much easier to weave a story into a linear dungeon than it is into a non-linear dungeon, at least for me. I find that their simplicity leaves a lot of room for you to play with, though it isn't impossible. Non-linear dungeons do lend themselves very well to mysteries, and they can be very fun in smaller settings, like if your players are exploring a witch's hut and different rooms are laid out for them, each one holding a different encounter. Maybe they have to gather different components of something or clues for something from the different rooms. And speaking of, I also think that it's very important to have some kind of goal or reason why your players showed up here in the first place, and have some kind of story they uncover while they're progressing through the dungeon. But I'll discuss that in more detail a little bit later. As a quick note, I also actually happen to have a witch's hut dungeon that I made a while back and never got a chance to run. If you want me to share that on this channel for you to either use in your own games or take inspiration from, let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to do that. And if you want an example of how I might run a linear dungeon, check out my Campaign 3 playlist. I'll leave a link below and a card above as always. Pretty much that entire campaign takes place in a giant dungeon. It's very linear, but it honestly ended up being one of my favorites, and I hope you like it too. It just really demonstrates just how much you can do with a simpler linear dungeon. But I've been talking about structure for pretty much this entire video so far, so let's talk a little bit about flavoring your dungeon and actually filling up the rooms and encounters that you might make in it. I already talked a little bit about this earlier when I talked about making the rooms for your dungeon less room-like, but it's much more than just that. And I think that the easiest place to start from is with what the dungeon actually is. You probably already have a concept of what you want it to be in your mind. Maybe it's an actual dungeon beneath the giant castle. Maybe it's a mind flayer colony. The possibilities are endless. You can use this to generate ideas for other parts of the dungeon and what might be in it, as well as how to flavor the ideas you already had and how to make them make sense in the context of the actual dungeon that you are running. For example, maybe you want a puzzle. Well, if you have an actual dungeon beneath the castle, there might be one particularly dangerous inmate that they keep behind a puzzle door. If you're generating ideas for this kind of dungeon, think what might be in a place like this. You might have a torture chamber, some cells, an armory, a place where the prisoner belongings are kept, and some cells. As a challenge, I challenge you to come up with some potential rooms for a dungeon like this. And when flavoring the individual rooms of the dungeon, I like to add more than just what the room is. It might just be a puzzle room, but what's discovered in it? What do the players actually find? If the players are in an actual dungeon, and maybe they're looking for a certain inmate, maybe the puzzle room also has a clue as to where they are. Maybe it was their old cell, but they cleverly escaped the puzzle, leaving marks on the gears and drawings on the floor of their plans to escape. But there might also be bloodstains on the wall where the guards caught them and dragged them to a new cell. This is where knowing your players' goals and knowing the story behind this dungeon really comes into play. Whenever I'm making rooms or flavoring them or doing anything for a dungeon, I always ask myself, how is this related to the story? How is this related to the goal? How is this related to the dungeon? I try to gear all of my ideas around what is going on, what my players' goals are, and what my players are trying to do. But more than just the rooms, what about the boss? You might think having a boss is kind of cliche, like why are they just waiting in this room? But it doesn't necessarily have to be very cliche, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be a boss. Just any climactic kind of encounter would do, like a very tense social encounter, for example. But if you do want a boss, here are a few ways you might go about doing it. Maybe the monster just lives here. Maybe they were trapped here. If you're doing a dungeon kind of dungeon, you might have the boss be the warden of the dungeon. Maybe it isn't a monster at all, per se, and rather a living part of the dungeon that comes to life when the players reach a certain room or grab a certain item. You could even say it's protecting something or cursed to be this way as a punishment of some kind, leaving little clues throughout the dungeon before leading to the big conclusion of what actually happened and why it is. And honestly, when I'm making a dungeon, I like to hop between all those different questions. I might be asking myself what might be in whatever kind of dungeon I'm making first, and and then jump right over to working some of my ideas in later on. I might switch between thinking about structure and thinking about what it actually is based on what ideas I have for which at the time. With stuff like this, my process is very nonlinear. And one of the reasons for this is that I might be thinking of it in a very linear way. For example, I might have a concept, then I might think about structure, and then I might move on to more finer details, but I might get stuck somewhere along the line, and so when that happens, I start thinking about something else in this dungeon that I might have more ideas for at the time, so I can keep that kind of creative flow going, and before I know it, I already have solved whatever I was hung up on before. For this reason, I like to keep a list of the stuff that I might need for the dungeon I'm working on, so that I have other things that I can work on and draw inspiration from as I go if I ever get stuck. Another reason why I might work in a very non-linear fashion like this is because I might start from different points. Like I said earlier, I might have a concept initially, or I might not, and if I don't, I might start with some kind of overall structure and build ideas from there. And those ideas could lead to even more ideas of what the dungeon is. They could lead into more ideas of how to flavor certain encounters. They could lead into the story. That could even lead into different rooms I might want. It all really depends on what I'm trying to do and how I started out making whatever dungeon I'm working on. But for one last example, to really pull all this together before I close out, let's return to the cave example that we started with. I already mentioned the social encounter of the hermit in the beginning of the cave that warns the players about incoming danger, and the stealth encounter that occurs when your players travel through a tunnel and up a precipitous path right beside a giant monster hanging over a deep chasm. And I gave a few pretty good reasons for why I think they might be there, I believe. But what about the trap, the combat, the puzzle, the boss? What about all of those and why they're there? Well, maybe your players get to the top and the trapped door that they find actually leads into a temple of some kind built in worship of whatever the monster is that lives on top of the mountain. Maybe it was abandoned a long time ago, so they locked the door to keep anybody else from entering it. The monsters inside are the undead remains of anybody unfortunate enough to be left behind, and the puzzle is an old ritual they used to complete in order to unlock the door to actually see the creature of their worship. And even then, there are plenty of open questions to build off of. Why did they abandon the temple? What else might be inside the temple? What turned the people undead? And all these things can lead into even more ideas that make for an even more engaging dungeon. Like I said, the process here is very non-linear, and if you want, feel free to build off of this idea yourself and see what you come up with. And if you do, let me know in the comments what you have. I'm really curious to see where this goes. And that's it. I know this was a bit of a departure from my usual style. It ended up being a little bit longer, but I still hope that I made some good points in it, and I still hope that you enjoyed it. I can honestly talk about dungeons for hours, and if you want me to talk about dungeons again, feel free to let me know in the comments. I will more than happily mention some of the points that I didn't get to here, that didn't have the time for here, in another video. And come back next Friday where I'll talk about serial versus episodic campaigns. These are two different campaign styles, at least a differentiation that I use, and I'll kind of just be talking about them, what they are, their drawbacks, their benefits of each, and how I go about running them. As always, again, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're able to gather something from it. I hope it's useful for you, and until next time, let's learn something.